She was a woman with a voice full of furious life, a human who had accidentally dialed the number to a tomb and spoken to the ghost within. He was a king who had mistaken silence for peace, a predator who had forgotten the feeling of a true hunt, until he heard her defiant, desperate plea. A call made in the dark had bound them, a thread of sound across an impossible distance, and the reckoning that followed had been swift, brutal, and his alone. This was not the story of how a king saved a mortal girl. It was the story of how her dying world, in its final, accidental prayer, had given his a reason to begin again. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, a miserable, weeping sky that matched the state of her apartment and her life. Nadia traced a crack in the ceiling with her eyes, a jagged path from the water-stained corner to the flickering fluorescent light of the galley kitchen. It was a roadmap of her own decay. The eviction notice was a crisp, white ghost on the counter, mocking her with its official font and its non-negotiable deadline. Tomorrow. She had until tomorrow to disappear, as if she weren't already invisible. Her phone felt heavy in her hand, a black mirror reflecting her own exhausted face. She scrolled through her contacts, a graveyard of half-hearted friendships and familial obligations. There was no one to call, no one who could hold the sheer, ugly weight of her failure. Her mother would offer platitudes and thinly veiled disappointment. Her friends, caught up in their own ascents, would offer a drink and a distraction she couldn't afford and didn't want. They wanted the fun Nadia, the witty Nadia, not this hollowed-out creature sitting on a floor sticky with spilled coffee and despair. Mark's number was still there. She stared at it, a masochistic impulse rising in her throat. She could call him. She could scream at him, let loose the torrent of rage and betrayal she'd been swallowing for weeks. He had left not with a bang, but with a text message, a cowardly string of characters that had detonated her world. This isn't working. I need space. Space he had apparently found in the bed of her coworker Janice, a woman whose laugh sounded like a dying hyena. Nadia had seen them yesterday, leaving a cafe, his hand on the small of Janice's back, with a familiarity that felt like a physical blow. The memory was a fresh bruise. Then there was Henderson, Mr. Henderson, her boss at the city archive, a man who wielded his minor authority like a medieval cudgel. He delighted in her misery, piling on extra shifts, losing her timesheets, making comments about her clothes that made her skin crawl. He was the reason she was behind on rent. He was the reason she felt a fresh wave of nausea every morning she walked through the archive's heavy oak doors. He was a small man enjoying a small kingdom of power, and she was his favorite peasant to grind under his heel. It was all too much. The cheating ex, the sadistic boss, the goddamned eviction notice. The weight of it pressed down, forcing the air from her lungs. She needed to let it out, just for a second. She needed to scream it into the void, to give voice to the poison before it dissolved her from the inside out. Her thumb hovered over Mark's name, then slipped. A misdial. Her finger had hit the number just below his, a random sequence she didn't recognize, probably a wrong number she'd forgotten to delete. It was already ringing. Fine. Let a stranger get an earful. It was better, somehow. More anonymous. A voice answered, a voice like stones shifting in a deep cave. It wasn't a greeting, just a low, resonant hum of acknowledgement. It sounded male, ancient. Nadia didn't wait for a response. The dam broke. "He left me," she began, the words tumbling out, sharp and broken. "After 5 years, he left me in a text message. A text message. Like I was a pizza order he was canceling. And for Janice, of all people. Janice, who microwaves fish in the break room and thinks Ayn Rand was a philosopher. Is that what I am? Is that all I was worth? Something to be traded in for a newer model who smells faintly of tilapia and selfishness?" The silence on the other end was absolute. It wasn't the silence of a dead line, it was the silence of listening. It was heavy, attentive, It unnerved her, but the need to speak was stronger than the strangeness of the moment. "And my boss," she plowed on, her voice cracking. "He's a troll. A petty, miserable little troll who gets off on making my life impossible. He cut my hours again, said there were budgetary concerns. But he hired his nephew last week, a kid who thinks microfiche is a type of pasta. I'm going to be homeless. I have an eviction notice sitting on my counter, and it feels like a death sentence. I did everything right. I worked hard, I paid my bills, I was a good partner, a good employee. And for what? To be thrown out? To be replaced? To be made to feel like nothing?" Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and angry. She wasn't just sad. She was incandescent with a rage that had nowhere to go. "I just wish they would disappear. All of them. I wish Mark would just fall off the face of the earth so I never have to see his stupid, handsome, lying face again. I wish Henderson would just vanish, get swallowed by a sinkhole. I wish this whole rotten world would just leave me alone." She choked on a sob, the confession leaving her breathless and empty. The apartment seemed darker, the silence on the other end of the line more profound. She had just screamed her darkest, most pathetic wishes to a complete stranger. Humiliation washed over her, cold and final. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Wrong number." She was about to hang up when the voice finally spoke. It was deeper than she'd realized, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the phone and into the bones of her hand. It held no judgment, no pity, no surprise. It held only a chilling, calm finality. "None of them will trouble you again." The line went dead. Nadia stared at her phone, the stranger's words echoing in the rain-soaked quiet of her room. It was just a weirdo, a crank, that's all. A strange, meaningless encounter in a life full of them. But as she sat there, shivering on the floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been talking to the void at all. She felt, with a certainty that terrified her, that the void had just answered back. The first sign was the silence. The next morning, Nadia woke up expecting the familiar dread of Mark's potential presence in her neighborhood, the sick lurch in her stomach at the thought of running into him. But the feeling was gone, replaced by a strange, unnerving quiet in her own mind. She checked her phone. No missed calls, no texts. She even, in a moment of weakness, checked his social media. Nothing. His profile, once a curated gallery of their life together, was gone, deactivated, as if he had ceased to exist online. A friend she texted later that day replied with confusion. "Mark? Didn't you hear? He packed up and left town. His roommate said he got a job offer in another country, left in the middle of the night. Didn't say goodbye to anyone." It was so unlike him. Mark was a creature of comfort and habit. He wouldn't leave his favorite coffee shop behind, let alone the country, without months of agonizing deliberation. It was a clean, surgical removal from her life. Too clean. The stranger's voice echoed in her memory. "None of them will trouble you again." She pushed the thought away, labeling it a bizarre coincidence. She had bigger problems. She had to face Henderson. Steeling herself, she walked to the archive, the termination letter she'd written in her bag, a small, defiant act before the inevitable. But when she arrived, the building was cordoned off with yellow tape. An ambulance was parked at the curb, its lights off, a silent, waiting vessel. A cluster of her colleagues stood huddled under an awning, their faces pale. "What happened?" Nadia asked Clara, a girl from acquisitions. Clara's eyes were wide. "It's Mr. Henderson. They found him this morning. He fell." "Fell?" "Down the main staircase," Clara whispered, gesturing toward the grand, spiraling marble steps in the atrium. "The paramedic said it looks like he tripped at the top. Broke his neck. He's dead, Nadia." A cold fist clenched in Nadia's stomach. Henderson was a creature of caution. He wore orthopedic shoes. He held the handrail like a lifeline. He wouldn't have tripped. She pictured the fall, the sickening tumble down those hard, unforgiving steps. Vanish. Get swallowed by a sinkhole. Her own words, spit into the phone in a fit of rage. This wasn't a sinkhole, but it was just as final. She went home in a daze, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. The world felt thin, unreal, as if she were walking through a dream. When she reached her apartment building, the landlord, a perpetually scowling man named Mr. Davies, was waiting for her by the mailboxes. He usually avoided her, his eyes sliding past as if she were already part of the building's sordid history. Tonight he was wringing his hands, a sheen of sweat on his bald head despite the evening chill. "Ms. Holloway," he began, his voice strained. "About the notice. There's been a misunderstanding." Nadia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "An administrative error," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes. "My apologies. Please, disregard it. And, if your rent is a little late this month, or any month, don't you worry about it. We can be flexible. Very flexible." He gave a tight, terrified smile and practically scurried away, fumbling with his keys as he retreated into his ground-floor apartment. Nadia stood frozen in the dim lobby. Landlords didn't have changes of heart. They didn't forgive rent. Not Mr. Davies. He was a man who would charge his own mother for an extra key. Something had happened. Someone had spoken to him. Someone had made him afraid. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside, she locked the door, leaning against it as her legs trembled. Mark was gone. Henderson was dead. Her eviction was cancelled. Her 3 wishes, whispered in a moment of desperate rage to a wrong number, had been granted. This was not a coincidence. This was not a miracle. This was a transaction. And she had no idea what she had just paid for it. Her phone lay on the counter, the same black, silent object as before, but now it felt like a relic from a dark ritual. She picked it up, her fingers shaking, and looked at the call history. There it was, an outgoing call at 11:58 p.m. No number listed, just unknown. The stranger's voice returned, no longer just a memory, but a living presence in the room. "None of them will trouble you again." It wasn't a promise of comfort. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of an act performed. She had lit a match in the dark, and a predator she couldn't comprehend had seen the flame. Now it was watching her. She could feel it. A cold, heavy, attentive presence, just like the silence on the phone. The rain had stopped, but a new kind of storm was just beginning, and she was standing directly in its path. The fear was a physical thing, a cold stone in her gut, but beneath it, something else was taking root. Anger. A sharp, clarifying rage. She was not a pawn in someone else's game. Her life, messy and broken as it was her own. Whoever was on the other end of that line had taken her words and twisted them into blood and whispers, making her an unwitting accomplice to what? A freak accident? A convenient disappearance? She refused to be a ghost in her own story, haunted by the consequences of an act she hadn't committed. She had to know. Her job at the city archive, the place of her daily torment under Henderson, now became her greatest asset. She knew its systems, its hidden databases, its labyrinthine records that stretched back centuries. The day after Henderson's funeral, an event she attended out of a morbid sense of duty, standing at the back and feeling like a murderer, she went to work. The new interim manager, a timid woman named Mrs. Gable, was so relieved to have someone competent on staff that she gave Nadia free rein. Nadia started with the phone number. Unknown was a dead end on her own device, but the city had resources. She used a connection in the IT department, a shy geek named Leo she'd once helped find a rare manuscript on medieval siege engines. She told him a doctored story about a harassing caller, and he, eager to play the hero, agreed to run a trace. "This is weird," he told her over the phone a day later, his voice hushed. "The number doesn't exist. Or rather, it exists, but it's a ghost. It's routed through a dozen encrypted servers, bouncing off satellites that were decommissioned in the 90s. It's like a digital phantom. But I found the origin point of the service contract. A shell corporation. Sylvain Holdings. Sylvain Holdings. The name meant nothing to her, but it was a thread. She spent the next 2 nights buried in financial records and property deeds, a world of dry paper that suddenly felt like a grimoire of dark secrets. Sylvain Holdings owned another company, which owned another. It was a complex web of ownership designed to obscure, to hide, to make the center impossible to find. But Nadia was patient. She was a researcher. She followed the thread through decades of legal jargon and financial misdirection until she found it. The knot at the center of the web. All the companies, all the properties were ultimately owned by a single estate. Valima. The name hit her like a physical blow. Every child in the city grew up with stories about the Valima estate. It was a black granite monolith perched on the highest cliff overlooking the sea, a place of Gothic spires and perpetual shadow. It had been there for centuries, unchanging, its windows dark, its gates permanently closed. Legend said it was the seat of the Vampire King, a creature so ancient and powerful that even other vampires spoke his name in whispers. The 1974 Blood Accord had brought vampires into a tense, fragile coexistence with humans, but the King of Valima had never attended a single council meeting. He was a recluse, a myth, a bedtime story to frighten children. His name was Sebastian Valima. The man, the thing, on the other end of the line. The world tilted on its axis. She hadn't confessed her darkest wishes to a random stranger. She had whispered them into the ear of a king who ruled from a throne of shadows. A being with the power to make people simply disappear. Her rage solidified into a cold, hard diamond of purpose. He had listened to her pain and used it as an excuse to play God. He had made her a reason for his violence. She wouldn't allow it. The decision was not rational. It was born of pure, undiluted defiance. She was going to confront him. The idea was insane. People who went to the Valmont estate did not come back. But what did she have to lose? A life she was about to be evicted from? A job under a man who was now dead because of her? A cheating ex who had vanished? Her old life was already gone, burned away by a single phone call. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. She took a bus to the edge of the city, to the winding coastal road that led up to the cliffs. The air grew colder, salt-laced and heavy with unspoken history. The gates to the estate were even more imposing in person. 20 feet of wrought iron shaped into thorns and sleeping gargoyles. They were locked tight. There was no bell, no intercom. It was a fortress designed to repel the world. Nadia took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She looked at the massive, unyielding gate, then at the high stone wall that stretched into the darkness on either side. Her eyes caught on an ancient oak tree, its thick, gnarled branches reaching over the wall like a skeletal hand. It was a foolish, reckless, suicidal idea. She started to climb. The climb was brutal. The ancient bark scraped her palms raw, and a cold, biting wind threatened to tear her from her perch. But every time her resolve wavered, she thought of Mark's empty social media page, of Henderson's body at the bottom of the stairs, of her landlord's terrified face. She was not a victim. She was a reckoning. When she finally hauled herself over the top of the wall, she dropped into a garden of impossible beauty and silence. It was a landscape of moonlight and shadow. White roses, their petals the color of bone, bloomed in defiance of the season. A marble path, slick with sea mist, wound through perfectly sculpted topiaries shaped like predatory birds. The air was still, heavy, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. The manor loomed before her, a mountain of black stone and stained glass, its windows like vacant eyes watching her approach. The main doors were carved from a wood so dark it seemed to drink the moonlight. They stood slightly ajar, an invitation into the abyss. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the oppressive silence. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was a cavern of cold and shadow. A grand staircase, the dark twin of the one at the archive, swept upwards into darkness. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, beeswax, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet. Dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight slanting from a high window, illuminating a vast, empty space. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. "I know you're here," she called out, her voice sounding small and thin in the immense space. "I know what you did." Silence answered her, a deep, listening silence. The same silence from the phone. "You had no right," she continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by her anger. "You had no right to interfere. That was my life, my pain, not your project to fix." A flicker of movement in the shadows at the top of the stairs. A figure detached itself from the darkness, descending without a sound. He was tall and lean, dressed in simple, dark clothing that made him seem a part of the house itself. His face was a masterpiece of classical sculpture, all sharp angles and pale, flawless skin. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, and his eyes were the color of ancient night, holding a depth that seemed to pull the light from the room. It was him, Sebastian Vallemont, the myth, the king. He stopped 10 feet from her, his presence a palpable force, a drop in pressure in the air. He didn't look menacing. He looked calm, attentive. He was studying her with an unnerving intensity, as if she were a rare specimen he had never encountered before. "You climbed the wall," he said. His voice was the same as on the phone, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her bones. It was not a question. "You didn't leave me much choice," she retorted, crossing her arms, a futile gesture of defiance. "You don't have a doorbell." A flicker of something, amusement, surprise, crossed his features, a barely perceptible shift in the marble of his face. "Few have ever felt the need to ring." "Well, I did," she snapped. "I have a few complaints for management. You listen to a woman's desperate, angry rant and decide to become her personal hitman? Who do you think you are?" "I am the man who answered the phone," he replied simply, his gaze unwavering. "You asked for them to disappear. I obliged." "That's not what I meant," she cried, the frustration and fear finally bubbling over. "It was a figure of speech. People say things they don't mean when they're hurting. They don't expect a literal monster to grant their wishes." "Am I a monster?" he asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. "I removed 2 sources of human malice from the world and frightened a 3rd into decency. By most mortal metrics, that would be considered a service." "You murdered a man." "A man who was slowly murdering your spirit," he countered, his voice dropping lower. "I heard it in your voice, the life in you, the fire. It was being extinguished. I simply removed the ones holding you underwater." She stared at him, speechless. He spoke of murder as if it were pest control. The sheer, ancient arrogance of it was breathtaking. And yet, he wasn't wrong. He had heard the truth of her despair. He had looked into the ugliest, most broken part of her, and instead of turning away, had acted. It was horrifying. It was monstrous. And a tiny, treacherous part of her felt a flicker of something akin to gratitude. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why me? A wrong number." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to recoil. His proximity was overwhelming, a field of immense gravity and cold. "For 500 years," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "this house has been silent. For 500 years, I have been silent. I have listened to the world die and be born again, and I have felt nothing. Then your voice came through the wire. It was not pleading, it was not praying, it was alive. It was a raw, furious, beautiful noise in a world that has been gray, for longer than your entire species has known how to write its own name. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the king, past the monster. She saw a profound, crushing loneliness, an isolation so complete it was a wonder he hadn't turned to dust. "You were not a project, Nadia Holloway," he said, speaking her name for the first time. "You were a surprise, and I have not been surprised in a very, very long time." His admission hung in the air between them, more shocking than any confession of murder. He hadn't seen her as a problem to be solved. He had seen her as a phenomenon to be witnessed. The girl who had nothing left to lose stood before a king who had lost everything centuries ago, and in the suffocating silence of his castle, she had become the only sound that mattered. He did not let her leave. He also did not lock her in a dungeon. The arrangement that followed was unspoken, a strange, suspended state of being. Nadia became a resident of the Valmont estate, a ghost haunting a ghost. She was given a suite of rooms with a balcony that overlooked the churning sea, furnished with dark, heavy antiques, and shelves filled with books bound in leather and smelling of time itself. She was a guest, a prisoner, a curiosity. She wasn't sure which. Days bled into a strange routine. She would wake to find a tray of food outside her door, human food, perfectly prepared, a silent acknowledgement of her needs. She would spend her hours exploring the castle's vast, silent library, its collection so extensive it could have rivaled any in the world. She read ancient histories, forgotten poetry, philosophical texts that argued the nature of a soul she was beginning to question. The castle was her cage, but it was a cage of infinite knowledge. Sebastian was a peripheral presence. He did not impose, did not demand her company, but she would feel him. A flicker of movement in a shadowed colonnade as she walked in the bone-white rose garden. The unnerving sensation of being watched as she read by the fire, only to look up and find the room empty. He was an observer, studying her with an intensity that was both flattering and terrifying. Slowly, they began to talk. Not in long, structured conversations, but in brief exchanges that felt like dropping stones into the deep well of his solitude. She would find him in the observatory at the top of the highest tower, staring at star charts that were centuries out of date. "You know they've discovered new planets since this was drawn," she said one night, her voice soft in the quiet space. He didn't turn from the telescope. "The stars do not change, only your perception of them." He looked at her then, his dark eyes reflecting the distant starlight. "You are not afraid of me?" It wasn't a question. "I was," she admitted. "Now, I'm mostly just angry and confused." "Anger is a familiar state for you," he observed, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "It is the color of your voice." Another time, she found him in a vast gallery filled with portraits. Hundreds of faces, men and women in the dress of different eras, all painted with masterful skill. None of them smiled. "Your family?" she asked. "My court," he corrected. "What remains of them? Dust and memory." "What happened to them?" His expression became distant, the loneliness she'd seen on that first night returning like a veil. "Time. Time is the most patient of assassins. Some grew weary of immortality. Some were lost to wars you have only read about in your history books. Some simply faded. Immortality is not a gift, Ms. Holloway. It is a test of endurance." She learned about him in these fragments. He was the last of his direct line, a king ruling over a kingdom of echoes. The blood accord, which he had never publicly acknowledged, was a construct of younger, more pragmatic vampires who saw coexistence as a means of survival. Sebastian saw it as a dilution, a surrender. He had chosen isolation instead. He had not fed on a human in over a century, subsisting on preserved blood stores that sustained but did not satisfy. He was starving, she realized, but not for blood. He was starving for meaning. In turn, he learned her. He would ask about the books she was reading, about her life before the phone call. He listened with that same unnerving, absolute attention. He seemed fascinated by the mundane details of her mortal life, her love of thunderstorms, her frustration with poorly organized filing systems, her specific, unyielding opinions on the proper way to make tea. To him, these were not trivialities. They were artifacts from a world he had long ago forgotten how to touch. One evening, a vampire appeared at the estate. He was old, but not ancient like Sebastian. His name was Victor, and he carried himself with the stiff formality of a royal vizier. He looked at Nadia with undisguised suspicion. "My lord," Victor said, bowing low to Sebastian, "the council is concerned. There are whispers." "Let them whisper," Sebastian replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Malachi Ravencrest speaks of your guest," Victor pressed, his eyes flicking to Nadia. "He claims you have broken your seclusion, that you have taken a human pet. He uses it to paint you as weak, decadent. He amasses power while you remain in your fortress." "Malachi is a carrion bird," Sebastian said, his voice laced with cold contempt. "He mistakes patience for weakness. He always has." "Patience can look like apathy, my king. Your enemies grow bold. They see her," he nodded at Nadia again, "as a vulnerability, a chink in the armor." "Then they are fools," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Leave us." Victor bowed again, his disapproval a palpable cloud, and vanished as silently as he had come. The air in the room was thick with tension. Nadia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the old windows. A chink in the armor, a vulnerability. That's what she was. Her presence here was not just a strange personal arrangement. It was a political statement, and it was putting a target on her back. "He's right, isn't he?" she said into the silence. "My being here is dangerous for you." Sebastian finally looked at her, and his eyes held a strange protective fire. "The only danger is to those who would be foolish enough to believe they could use you to reach me." His words should have been comforting, a promise of his immense power shielding her. But instead, they sent a fresh wave of fear through her. He wasn't just observing her anymore, he was protecting his investment. And Nadia knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that the carrion birds were circling. She had escaped the small, petty monsters of her human life, only to find herself living in the shadow of a much larger one, attracting the attention of others who were waiting for him to show a single moment of weakness. And she was that weakness. The end of her strange, suspended peace came with the scent of rain and the sound of breaking glass. Nadia had been on her balcony, watching a storm roll in from the sea, the air electric with ozone. She found a strange comfort in the untamable fury of nature. It was a reflection of the tempest that had defined her own life recently. Sebastian was elsewhere in the castle, perhaps in his observatory, charting the storm's progress, or in the gallery, communing with his ghosts. In the past weeks, the vast emptiness of the castle had begun to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, a quiet harbor from the world. She had been a fool to feel safe. One moment she was breathing in the salty air, the next, the glass of the balcony doors behind her exploded inwards. Two figures, blurs of impossible speed, were in her room. They were not like Sebastian. Where he was elegant stillness, they were coiled violence. Their eyes glowed with a feral, hungry light, and their smiles were thin, cruel cuts in pale faces. "The king's little songbird," one of them sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Malachi sends his regards." Nadia didn't have time to scream. A hand, cold as iron, clamped over her mouth, and another arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her from her feet as if she weighed nothing. The world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of movement. The wind whipped past her ears, and the castle, her strange and silent home, shrank with impossible speed. She caught a fleeting glimpse of Sebastian's tower, a dark finger pointing at the stormy sky, before they plunged into the thick woods that bordered the estate. They were running, but their feet barely seemed to touch the ground. Branches whipped at her face, and the cold seeped into her bones. Her captors were silent now, their focus entirely on speed. She struggled, a useless, frantic thrashing against an unyielding force. The vampire holding her simply tightened his grip, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Their destination was a ruin deep in the forest, the crumbling remains of an old monastery. Within its skeletal walls, a dozen other vampires waited, their eyes all turning to her as she was thrown to the damp stone floor. A man stepped forward from the group, separating himself from the shadows. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with silver hair that caught the faint light and eyes the color of a winter sky. He radiated an aura of smug, confident power. This had to be Malachi Ravencrest. "Nadia Holloway," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to his thugs. "A pleasure. I must confess I don't see the appeal. You're so fragile." He circled her like a wolf inspecting its prey. But then, our dear Sebastian always did have a taste for the ephemeral, a weakness I've long maintained. Nadia pushed herself up, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. "What do you want?" Malachi laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "What does any ambitious man want, my dear? A crown. Sebastian has sat on his throne in silence for too long. He has grown stagnant, a relic. The world has changed, and the vampire nation needs a king who will engage with it, lead it, not hide from it. The blood accord he so despises is a tool, and he refuses to wield it." He crouched down, his cold eyes boring into hers. "But he is old, powerful, unassailable in his fortress. Until you." "I'm nothing to him," she lied, her voice shaking. "Oh, I think not," Malachi purred. "He slaughtered 2 humans and terrified a 3rd for you. He broke centuries of seclusion for you. You, a mortal girl who dialed a wrong number, are the first new thing to happen to him in half a millennium. You are not nothing. You are his focal point, his obsession, and therefore his leverage." He stood up, turning to one of his followers. "Begin." Terror, pure and absolute, seized her. The vampire who had sneered at her earlier grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. His fangs descended, long and needle-sharp. Nadia screamed then, a raw, piercing sound that was swallowed by the ruins and the storm. He bit into the side of her neck. The pain was sharp, electric, a blinding agony that stole her breath. But worse than the pain was the feeling of her life being drawn out of her. It was an invasive, violating emptiness, a draining of warmth, of strength, of self. The world began to waver, the edges of her vision turning gray and fuzzy. Her heartbeat, so strong and steady just moments before, became a weak, frantic flutter. She could hear Malachi talking, his voice seeming to come from a great distance. "Don't kill her, not yet. We want him to find her like this, broken, dying. We want him to have to make the choice. Let her die and prove he feels nothing, or turn her and bind himself to a weakness he can never discard. Either way, he is diminished. He is compromised." The vampire released her, and she collapsed to the floor, a discarded doll. Her body was impossibly cold, her limbs heavy as lead. She could feel the blood, her blood, trickling from the wound, a warm path down her cold skin. She tried to move, to speak, but she had no strength left. Her vision tunneled, the faces of the vampires above her blurring into pale smudges. Her last conscious thought was of Sebastian, of his dark, lonely eyes. She had been a surprise to him. A noise in the silence, and now she was going to be the silence that broke him. The storm that had been gathering over the sea broke with a fury that mirrored the one inside Sebastien. He felt her absence the moment it happened. A sudden, violent severing of the thread of awareness he had unconsciously maintained around her. The silence that descended was not the familiar, peaceful quiet of his castle. It was the dead, empty silence of a tomb. He had been in his library, tracing the lines of a forgotten map, and the sudden void where her presence had been was more jarring than the loudest scream. He didn't need to search. He could smell them. The scent of lesser, hungrier vampires on his land. a taint in the clean, salt-laced air. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the scent of her fear. He moved. The concept of speed as humans understood it became irrelevant. He was a shadow flowing through his own halls, a whisper of displaced air. The shattered glass of her balcony doors crunched under his boots, a sound that resonated in the hollow of his chest like a prophecy of her own brokenness. Her scent, laced with terror, was a clear path leading away from the castle, into the storm-tossed woods. For centuries, his rage had been a cold thing, a glacier of ancient contempt for a world that constantly disappointed him. Now, for the first time in memory, it burned. It was a white-hot, singular inferno with one name at its core: Nadia. They had taken her. They had put their hands on the one thing in his stagnant gray existence that felt real, and for that, there was no negotiation. There was only annihilation. He followed the trail to the monastery ruins. The storm was at its peak, lightning splitting the sky and illuminating the skeletal remains of the building. He could hear their heartbeats within, a dozen frantic, arrogant pulses, and one, so faint it was nearly imperceptible, a weak, fluttering thing on the verge of stopping. Hers. He did not enter through the door. He came through the wall, a blur of motion that sent ancient stones scattering like pebbles. For a moment he was just a shape in the shadows, a presence that made the air crackle and the temperature plummet. The dozen vampires turned, their smug expressions dissolving into shock, then fear. Malachi Ravencrest was the first to find his voice. "Sebastian! So good of you to join us. We were just getting to know your charming little—" He never finished the sentence. Sebastian crossed the 20 feet between them in less than a heartbeat. His hand closed around Malachi's throat, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. Malachi's eyes widened, his hands clawing uselessly at the iron grip. "You speak of weakness." Sebastian's voice was a low, terrifying calm, the quiet at the center of a hurricane. "Let me show you the weakness of ambition." He did not bother with a prolonged fight. He was an ancient, a king. They were children playing with fire. A sharp twist and the sound of snapping bone echoed in the chamber. Malachi's head lolled at an impossible angle, his surprise forever etched on his face. Sebastian dropped the body, and it crumbled to dust before it hit the floor. The other vampires, frozen in horror for a fatal second, finally reacted. They attacked, a swarm of fangs and claws. It was futile. To them he was a storm, a force of nature. A hand through a chest here, a head torn from its shoulders there. He moved through them like a reaper through wheat, his movements economical, precise, and utterly final. It was not a battle. It was a culling. Each life he extinguished was a punctuation mark in a single cohesive statement. She is mine. Within a minute, it was over. The chamber was silent, save for the drumming of the rain and the rasp of his own breathing. A dozen piles of gray dust littered the floor, swirling in the wind that whipped through the broken arches. And then he saw her. She was crumpled at the far end of the chamber, a small, still heap in the darkness. He was at her side in an instant, kneeling in the dirt and dust of his enemies. He gathered her into his arms, and the howling thing in his chest, the one that had stirred when he first held her dying form, broke free. Her skin was colder than the stone floor. The wound in her neck was a dark, ugly mar, and the front of her shirt was soaked in blood. Her heartbeat was a ghost, a faint, thready whisper against his ear. Thump, thump, thump. The spaces between the beats grew longer, stretching into an eternity of silence. He held the ending of her in his hands. He was too late. He had been too late. The rage that had fueled him evaporated, leaving behind a cold, vast emptiness that was worse than any loneliness he had ever known. He had let the one sound in his silent world be extinguished. He looked down at her face, pale and still in the faint light. Even now, on the precipice of death, her features held the echo of that fire he had heard in her voice. The defiance in the line of her jaw, the stubborn set of her brow. He had removed the things that were killing her spirit, only to let these animals kill her body. But she was not gone. Not yet. The final thread of her life had not yet snapped. He had a choice. A terrible, selfish, monstrous choice. He could let her go, let her find whatever peace or oblivion awaited mortals, respecting the boundary between their two worlds. It would be the right thing to do, the noble thing. Or he could refuse. He could deny death its claim. He could shatter the boundary, pull her across the veil into his own world of shadow and endless time. He could turn her. It would be a violation, a binding of her fate to his without her consent. He would be forcing upon her the very curse of endurance he had lamented. He thought of the centuries ahead, the silence returning, but this time it would be heavier, deeper, because now he knew what it was to hear something else. He thought of her voice on the phone, raw and full of life. He thought of her standing in his hall, furious and unafraid. He thought of her in his library, her brow furrowed in concentration. He could not lose that. He would not. Nobility was a luxury for those with nothing to lose. He had just found the one thing he could not bear to part with. "Forgive me," he whispered to her still form, his voice thick with a grief and a resolve that were two sides of the same coin. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her cold skin just below the ugly wound left by another. His own fangs descended. This was not the savage, hungry bite of a predator. It was a sacrament, a desperate prayer. He pierced the delicate skin of her wrist, where her pulse was a barely perceptible flicker, and let his own blood, ancient and impossibly potent, well up. He pressed his wrist to her lips, forcing the cold, metallic taste of his life into her dying body. Then he bit down on his own tongue, filling his mouth with the essence of his being, and sealed her lips with his own, breathing his immortal life into her. He was not just saving her. He was remaking her in the image of his own desperate, selfish love. The world around them faded to nothing but the transfer of life, the defiance of death, and the beginning of a new, eternal silence they would now have to share. Waking was not a gentle process. It was a violent, sensory explosion. The first thing Nadia registered was sound, the frantic, terrified drumming of a heart. It took her a moment to realize it was her own, beating with a speed and clarity that was utterly alien. Then came sight. The muted gray light of the dawn filtering through the high-arched window of her room was no longer soft. It was a dazzling, intricate tapestry of photons, each dust mote dancing within it a distinct and separate jewel. The scent of the sea, the stone, the old wood of the castle, they were not just smells, but complex layers of information, a language she was suddenly innately fluent in. And then there was the thirst. It was a clawing, burning thing at the back of her throat, an all-consuming fire that eclipsed every other sensation. It was a primal, desperate need for something she couldn't name, but knew she had to have. She sat up, the movement fluid and effortless. Her body felt new. The familiar aches and limitations of her human form were gone, replaced by a coiled spring of potential energy. She looked down at her hands. Her skin was pale, flawless, the calluses from climbing the wall, and the faint scars from a childhood of scraped knees completely vanished. She was a pristine, perfect copy of herself, and it felt utterly wrong. Memory returned in a flood, the ruins, Malachi, the searing pain in her neck, the feeling of her life draining away, the cold, the end. She remembered dying. She touched her neck. The skin was smooth, unbroken. But the memory of the wound was still there, a phantom ache. Sebastian was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, watching her. He was as still as the stone gargoyles outside, his dark eyes holding a universe of exhaustion, grief, and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying certainty. The new senses, the impossible strength, the burning thirst. She knew what he had done. No, she whispered, the word a dry rasp in her throat. She looked at him, and the confusion and fear coalesced into a tidal wave of pure, incandescent rage. No, you didn't. You had no right! She was off the bed in a flash, crossing the room to stand before him, her new body thrumming with a power she didn't know how to control. You had no right to make that choice for me. I was dying. You should have let me die. I could not, he said, his voice quiet, heavy with the weight of his decision. Because of what? Your surprise? She spat, throwing his own words back at him. Your new toy? Was I so entertaining that you couldn't bear to lose your plaything? You condemned me to this monstrosity, to be like you. She struck him then, a blind, furious slap. It was an act of pure human rage, but the impact was anything but. Her hand connected with his face with a crack like stone striking stone. It didn't move him an inch, but the force of the blow sent a shocking vibration up her own arm. She stared at her hand, then at his impassive face, and the reality of the change crashed down on her. She was one of them now, a monster. Tears, hot and surprisingly real, welled in her eyes. The rage collapsed, leaving behind a grief so profound it buckled her knees. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. "What have you done to me?" she sobbed, the sound raw and broken. He knelt before her, not touching, but his presence was a heavy cloak in the air. "I chose the existence I know over the oblivion I do not," he said, his voice laced with a pain that mirrored her own. "It was a selfish choice, the most selfish act of my very long life. I saved you for myself, not for you. And for that, I will never be able to ask for your forgiveness." His honesty was a disarming blow. She had expected justifications, arrogance, the cold logic of a king. She had not expected this raw, painful confession. She looked at him through her tears, at this ancient, powerful creature kneeling on the floor before her, looking utterly broken. The burning in her throat intensified, a demanding, agonizing pulse. She clutched her neck, a groan escaping her lips. Sebastian rose and went to a small, ornate chest by the window. He returned with a crystal goblet filled with a dark, ruby-red liquid. The scent of it hit her like a physical force, rich and metallic and intoxicating. It was what she craved. Her body screamed for it. "Drink," he said softly, offering it to her. "No," she resisted, even as her fangs, sharp and unfamiliar, pricked her own lips. "You must," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm, "or the thirst will drive you mad. It will consume everything you are until only the hunger remains." Her hand trembled as she took the goblet. She looked from the dark liquid to his face. She saw no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, shared sorrow. He had not done this to control her, but to keep her. He had damned her to save himself from the silence. Slowly, she raised the goblet to her lips and drank. The blood was warm, vital, and as it slid down her throat, the burning fire was quenched, replaced by a wave of strength and life so potent it made her gasp. The world snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. The grief was still there, a hard knot in her chest, but it was no longer all-consuming. She could think again. She lowered the empty glass, her hand steady now. She looked at Sebastian, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she understood the depth of his loneliness, the desperation that had driven him. He had not just saved her from death, he had saved her for a life with him, the only way he knew how. The anger was gone, washed away by the blood, replaced by a slow, dawning, and deeply complicated gratitude. "You saved me," she said, the words quiet, a statement of fact that held no accusation. He finally met her gaze, and the centuries of solitude in his eyes seemed to recede, just for a moment. He shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "You saved me first," he said, his voice a low murmur that filled the space between them. "I just returned the call." The words hung in the air, a final, perfect piece clicking into place. It had never been about him fixing her life. It had been about her accidentally restarting his. The call had been a lifeline thrown into the dark, and he had simply refused to let go. The castle was no longer a cage or a sanctuary. It was home. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding. Nadia learned to navigate her new existence with Sebastian as her guide. He taught her control, showing her how to command the new strength that thrummed beneath her skin, how to manage the thirst that was now a constant, low hum in her blood. He showed her the world through his ancient eyes, pointing out constellations that had shifted over millennia, telling her the true stories behind the myths in her history books. She, in turn, brought life back to his stone fortress. She filled the library with new books, arguing with him about modern philosophy and literature. She opened windows that had been sealed for centuries, letting the sea air and sunlight, which, to her surprise, did not harm them, another human myth, chase the shadows from the corners. She made him talk, drawing out the memories and experiences of his long life, not as a historian, but as someone who genuinely wanted to know the man behind the crown. She was no longer Nadia Holloway, the girl with a list of problems to vent to a stranger. That girl had died in the ruins of a monastery. She was someone new, someone forged in blood and desperation, and a profound, unexpected connection. She found she had an aptitude for the politics of the vampire world, a sharp, intuitive understanding of power that Sebastien, in his long isolation, had let atrophy. She read the reports from the Vampire Council that he had ignored for decades, seeing the patterns of ambition and betrayal he had dismissed as petty squabbles. "Malachi was right about one thing," she said one night, as they stood on the balcony where her old life had ended and this new one had begun. "You can't rule from the shadows forever. They don't fear a myth. They fear a presence." He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she was beginning to recognize as a deep, abiding love. "And what would you have me do, my queen?" The title slipped from his lips as if it had always belonged to her. "Stop whispering and start roaring," she replied, a fierce smile touching her lips. "It's time they remembered who their king is. And it's time they met his queen." He took her hand, his fingers, once so cold, now feeling like a familiar warmth against her own. Together, they looked out at the world below. A world of mortals and monsters, of politics and power, of endless nights stretching before them. She was no longer a victim of fate, but a creator of destiny. Her journey had begun with a wrong number, a desperate plea into the void. But in the end, she hadn't been calling for a savior. She had been answering a summons she never knew she'd received, to a throne she never knew she was meant to share. And the king beside her, who had answered her call, was finally ready to rule again,